Okay, get this. 18th century Edinburgh, kind of the philosophical capital of the world, apparently giving
Mm,
Paris, a serious run for its money, intellectually speaking.
it really was. And our source for today, Julian Baggini's book, The Great Guide, argues David Hume, a Scot from that time, was maybe the greatest philosopher of the era, maybe ever.
It's interesting because you often hear Hume described as like super abstract, right? Head in the clouds.
Right, very theoretical. But the book makes a strong case that that's not really the whole picture.
Hmm.
For Hume, digging into how our minds work, all that stuff, it wasn't just theory for theory's sake.
Yeah.
No, it was foundational. It was about figuring out how to actually live a good life, practically speaking.
So we're digging into Baggini's book, which, interestingly, looks at Hume's philosophy through the lens of his own life.
Which is a great approach.
Yeah. And our mission, basically, is to pull out Hume's surprisingly, well, down-to-earth advice for living well by connecting his big ideas to how he actually conducted himself.
That common image, then, the abstract Hume. Cause and effect, perception, critiques of religion.
Things that maybe don't immediately scream life advice.
But Baggini makes a really strong case that this is a misunderstanding. Hume's deep dives into metaphysics, they weren't the main goal, according to Baggini.
Like, what was the main goal then?
Practical morality, understanding human nature, our place in the world. Hume himself said something like, the most abstract speculations become subservient to practical morality.
Oh, okay. So the abstract stuff served the practical.
That's the idea. It was meant to make morality sort of clearer and more persuasive.
That puts a different spin on it. So even something like cause and effect wasn't just a mental exercise.
Not at all. Hume saw it as fundamental to how we live every day, how we expect things to happen, how we act. It's all tied to experience.
Experience. He called that the great guide of human life, didn't he?
He did. Everything had to be grounded in experience and observation, not just floating theories.
And it seems this practical focus wasn't just in his writing. Baggini paints a picture of Hume actually living these principles.
Yes, modeling a life that was gentle, reasonable, amiable.
Which sounds, well, quite appealing compared to a lot of public discourse now.
It really does. He was big on human sympathy, balancing it with rationality, not getting pulled to extremes, not overly hyping science or just bashing religion wholesale.
A sense of balance.
Crucially, yeah. For him, understanding human nature, how we tick, was the key to, well, practical ethics and figuring out our place in the world.
He was grounding his ideas. Where?
In experience. He called experience the great guide of human life. It wasn't just about pure logic, detached from reality.
Okay, like cause and effect. That feels pretty abstract.
Well, yes and no. For Hume, it wasn't just some brain teaser. It was about how we actually experience the world every single day. We see one thing happen, then another.
And we assume there's a link.
We just do. And Hume was fascinated by why we make that jump,
Yeah.
always tying it back to that everyday observation of, one billiard ball hitting another. And apparently, he didn't just write about this stuff. He lived it.
How so?
Well, a big takeaway from the book is how Hume's own life sort of modeled the good life he described. He really championed human sympathy, our capacity for empathy.
Feeling with others, not just thinking about them.
Maybe even more important than cold, hard rationality sometimes. And he wasn't an extremist in his thinking either.
Balanced, do you mean?
Very. He took a moderate stance on big debates like religion versus science, avoided the dogmatic extremes on either side.
Okay, but here's what I found really striking from the outline. Despite being this huge intellect, he didn't let it, take over his whole life.
Not at all. That's crucial. He never let the pursuit of knowledge overshadow the simple things. Good food, wine, conversation, games.
Backgammon, apparently.
Yeah, exactly. Enjoying life. So a key takeaway here is really Hume's belief in integrating the life of the mind with, well, simple pleasures. A reminder that living well isn't just about deep thoughts.
It's about the whole experience.
You got it. The book describes his life as gentle, reasonable, amiable. Qualities Baggini notes are maybe a bit lacking in public discourse today.
That's putting it mildly.
Right, and that's central to the book's method, understanding Hume as a synoptic whole. You look at the life and the work together, they illuminate each other.
Which does make you wonder, though. If he was so insightful, so balanced, seemingly had a good grip on living well, why isn't he like a household name the way some other philosophers are?
It's a great question, and the source offers a few thoughts. It suggests Hume just didn't fit the mold of the tragic or misunderstood genius.
No suffering artist vibe?
Not really. He wasn't dark or brooding. By most accounts, he was pretty cheerful. People liked him. He was respected in his lifetime. He died, loved and renowned.
Not much drama there for the biographers.
And the book also argues his ideas, while profound, were often just too, well, sensible. They weren't designed to shock or provoke in the way some other philosophies were, just solid insights.
They say sense. Salt doesn't always grab headlines.
Yeah.
Now, speaking of insights, the book gets into why context is important in philosophy, and this leads to something quite difficult.
Yeah.
Hume's blind spot.
Yeah, the book really critiques that tendency sometimes in philosophy to just look at the ideas themselves, floating free, without considering the person, the time, the place.
The who, when, and where.
Right, and then it zooms in on Hume's own context. His upbringing wasn't in some bustling metropolis, but in Churnside, Scotland, a quiet, sort of unassuming place.
They even mentioned the David Hume walk there now, though for a long time there wasn't much, right? Just maybe a street name recently, David Hume View, and a plaque somewhere.
He seems like it. But then the book has to confront head-on a really uncomfortable part of Hume's legacy, his racism.
Yeah, that notorious footnote.
The source doesn't gloss over it. It quotes that awful footnote where he talks about the supposed inferiority of black people. And Baggini is clear, while you can try to understand it as a product of his time, you absolutely cannot excuse it.
No, absolutely not. And it's powerful how the book mentions James Beattie, who was around at the same time.
And used Hume's own methods, empirical arguments, evidence.
To completely rebut Hume's racist claims, right then and there.
It's such a stark lesson, isn't it?
Yeah.
Even the most brilliant minds, you can't follow them blindly. You have to question everything.
It really underscores that need for intellectual humility. The book makes the point that even a genius like Hume is shaped by their environment, their society, and can hold these deeply, deeply flawed views.
And acknowledging that the book suggests isn't about letting historical figures off the hook. It's about understanding how pervasive biases can be, maybe even making us aware of our own potential blind spots today.
A sobering thought, definitely. Okay, so shifting gears a bit, the book looks at Hume's early life, his student days. Sounds like he was maybe a bit too intense.
Well, he started university incredibly young. Enrolled at Edinburgh before he was even 12.
12, wow.
Yeah. And there's this fun little detail. The book mentions new professorships were apparently funded by a tax on beer.
Huh. A pint for philosophy? Love it.
But yeah, that intense study early on,
Yeah.
it seems it took a real toll after about 6 months of just relentless work.
He crashed.
Big time. Fell into what sounds like a pretty severe depression. He called it the disease of the learned.
The disease of the learned.
Yeah, his own words. He described feeling like all my ardor seemed in a moment to be extinguished, just burnt out.
And how did he get out of it?
Balance. That was his discovery. Less intense, obsessive study, more physical activity, exercise, relaxation, and crucially, social interaction, spending time with people.
It's a timeless lesson, isn't it? He learned it the hard way.
He really did, and he passed it on. Years later, he advised his nephew to get daily exercise, rain or shine, and told this little parable about a writer who actually gets there faster by taking it a bit easier sometimes.
Okay, so to really focus on his major work, his big book, Hume made a pretty significant life change.
Right, this brings up, what conditions are maybe best for deep thinking. When he was 23, Hume decided to pack up and move to France.
Why France?
Mainly practical reasons, according to the book. Fewer distractions than in Britain, and it was cheaper to live there. He made this resolution to be frugal and just pour everything into literature, which back then meant learning and scholarship in general, not just novels.
And this move, it seems, ties into this bigger theme in his life.
Yeah.
Wanting independence.
Definitely. Financial security was important to him, not for luxury, but for the freedom it gave him to pursue his ideas without having to, compromise or answer to patrons too much.
And the book connects this to the Republic of Letters, this idea of scholars communicating across borders.
Yeah, even before he physically went to France, he was part of this intellectual network, exchanging letters, ideas, almost like an 18th century internet in a way.
That's a great analogy. Where in France did he end up?
He settled in a town called La Flèche. And interestingly, it seems to have been quite an intellectually stimulating environment. There was a Jesuit college there, but the scholars were apparently quite open-minded, interested in newer, even controversial ideas, people like Descartes and Malebranche.
So he wasn't isolated.
Not at all. He dove right in, studying Malebranche, Bayle, Descartes, Berkeley. A real immersion.
Okay, so this sets up that classic philosophical showdown. Hume versus Descartes. Very different approaches, it sounds like.
Fundamentally different, yeah. The book explains Descartes' famous method of doubt. Start by doubting absolutely everything you think you know to find a certain foundation.
Wipe the slate clean.
Right. Hume looked at that and basically said, hang on. He called it antecedent skepticism and argued first that it's psychologically impossible to actually maintain that level of doubt consistently. And second, even if you could, it wouldn't necessarily lead you to truth.
So Descartes tries to build knowledge up from pure reason, from abstract principles he hopes are certain.
Hume starts somewhere completely different. Human nature and experience. He famously said, the science of man is the only solid foundation for the other sciences. Everything has to be grounded in how we actually think and perceive.
So that's the empiricism versus rationalism.
Hume is the empiricist, wanting to use the experimental method, observation, and experience as the basis for philosophy. Descartes is the rationalist, starting from pure reason and deduction.
It's kind of ironic, though, isn't it? Descartes was a scientist, yet for understanding human nature, he relied more on introspection and reason.
The book points that out, too. It's a really good reminder, actually, that even brilliant scientists can have philosophical biases, and conversely, someone without a scientific background can have perfectly valid insights into the implications of science.
That's a great point. The book offers a sort of Humean principle there, right? To get an accurate view, you need to pay attention to all kinds of experience, not just your specialized little corner.
Don't let your expertise blind you to the bigger picture.
Now, Hume is definitely known for skepticism, but it wasn't like total nihilism, was it? There were limits.
Absolutely. For one thing, the book mentions he really disliked factionalism, extreme partisanship. He saw how rigidly held beliefs could tear society apart and undermine morality.
He sounds quite relevant today.
Doesn't he? And his skepticism had specific targets. The book talks about his famous arguments against miracles. His approach wasn't necessarily to say miracles are impossible, but that we essentially never have enough reliable testimony, enough good evidence, to justify believing one actually happened. He set out some really strict conditions for what would count as believable evidence for such an extraordinary claim.
But he handled the religious angle quite carefully.
Diplomatically, yeah.
Yeah.
He didn't directly attack, say, biblical miracles. Instead, he argued that belief in them could never be founded on reason or evidence. It had to be based on faith. He basically said, look, religion is founded on faith, not reason, and that's that.
Kind of separated the two realms.
Pretty much. And the book highlights the delicious irony that he apparently conceived these very arguments while staying at a Jesuit college in La Flèche.
He must have had a sense of humor about it.
Seems so. He even made a comment about it himself later on.
So speaking of La Flèche, he wasn't actually living in the college, right? He was nearby.
Correct. The source mentions he lodged in a house called Yverdon, just outside the main town overlooking it. Baggini actually visited the place.
Did they know which room was his?
Well, they saw a room that was believed to have been his. Hard to know for sure after all this time, but you get the sense he enjoyed his time there. He wrote positively about the French people, called them civil and sociable, admired their culture.
Okay, let's pivot back to his core ideas about living well.
Yeah.
What was his take on morality? How do we become good people?
Well, a key concept for Hume here is habit. He believed that virtue isn't just about knowing what's right. It's about doing what's right consistently until it becomes second nature. Practice makes perfect, essentially.
Like building a good character through repetition.
And the book points out this resonates strongly with thinkers like Confucius and Aristotle. Virtue as a practice skill.
Did Hume engage much with Aristotle? Seems like a natural connection.
Surprisingly little, according to the source. Even though the library at La Flèche had Aristotle's works, Hume barely mentions him. There's apparently only one minor point of disagreement noted, something about self-valuation or pride.
Oh, strange. But he did share that idea of virtue as a mean, a balance.
Yes, very much so. The book uses the example of frugality. It's the virtuous middle path between being stingy or miserly avarice on one side and being reckless with money, prodigality, on the other.
Find the sweet spot. Which again sounds like Aristotle and Confucius too.
That parallel with Confucius is quite strong. And for all three, Hume, Aristotle, Confucius ethics wasn't just confined to big moral dilemmas, it covered a broader territory.
Like what?
Things like politeness, good manners, social graces, wit, basically any quality or action that makes a person agreeable or useful to themselves and others.
So being charming could be seen as a kind of virtue.
In Hume's broad sense, yes. The book notes that English sometimes blurs the lines between what we might call moral virtues and, say, talents or social skills more than some other philosophical traditions.
So when Hume admired French customs, it wasn't just that they were pleasant, it was seen as morally good.
In a way, yes. He saw those praiseworthy social habits as contributing to a better, more agreeable society, which he considered morally commendable, even if a society isn't like a person with intentions.
Got it. And it was during this productive time in the flesh that he really hammered out his masterpiece, the treatise.
That's the consensus, yes. The book confirms a treatise of human nature was largely composed there, maybe finished shortly after he left. Scholars debate the exact dates, but La Flèche was definitely the crucible for it.
And that book contains some really heavy-hitting ideas, like the famous problem of induction. Can you unpack that a bit? It sounds complicated.
It is a bit mind-bending, but let's try. Okay, think about simple cause and effect. We see the sun rise every single day.
Right, so we expect it to rise tomorrow.
We feel absolutely certain about it. Hume's point is, why are we so certain? Just because something has happened millions of times in the past, does that logically guarantee it will happen again in the future?
I guess. No. It's incredibly likely, but maybe not 100% logical certainty.
That's Hume's point. There's no logical contradiction in imagining that tomorrow the laws of physics suddenly change and the sun doesn't rise. It seems absurd, but it's not logically impossible in the way that, say, a married bachelor is impossible.
So our belief that the future will resemble the past, it's not based on pure logic.
Not according to Hume. It's based on habit, on custom, on our psychological expectation built up through repeated experience. But there's no foolproof logical proof.
But wait, people say everything must have a cause. Doesn't that prove it?
But Hume would say that statement assumes the very thing it's trying to prove. You're assuming universal causation to argue for universal causation. It's circular reasoning.
Okay, my head hurts a little.
It's meant to. He went even deeper, questioning whether we even directly perceive the causal link itself, or just one event constantly followed by another. Basically asking, how can we logically justify generalizing from past experiences to future rules? We see the sun rise every day, so we expect it tomorrow. But is that expectation logically sound? Logically, no. You can't get a guaranteed future conclusion just from past premises. The future could be different.
Even though we deeply believe effects follow causes.
Right. We believe it strongly. But Hume points out, you can imagine a cause without its usual effect. There's no logical contradiction in imagining the sun not rising tomorrow. So there's no logical proof it must.
What about the intuition that everything must have a cause?
Hume says that just assumes the very thing you're trying to prove. It begs the question. His skepticism even questions if we see causation at all, or just events happening one after another.
So we just observe constant conjunction, as you said earlier.
Yes. And this constant conjunction leads to a customary transition in our minds, a feeling of expectation. It's powerful, permanent, irresistible, and universal, he says, but not rationally proven.
We have to believe it to function, but we can't ultimately prove it's true.
That's the core of it. It's a psychological necessity, not a logical certainty.
So what's the upshot? We just give up on cause and effect?
No, not at all. Hume says our belief in cause and effect is a kind of natural instinct. It's permanent, irresistible, and universal. We can't not believe in it to function in the world. It's a practical necessity, even if it lacks that ultimate rational justification we might crave.
Okay, but then if we can believe in cause and effect without absolute proof, why can't we believe in, say, God or miracles on the same basis, if proof isn't the final word?
That's a tricky question, isn't it? Hume's answer, kind of channeling Isaac Newton, was essentially about necessity. We need to assume cause and effect to make any sense of the world, to do science, to live our lives. Belief in supernatural beings or events, he argued, isn't similarly essential for navigating reality.
So it's about minimal assumptions.
The book suggests a sort of Humean maxim here. Assume no more and no less than you absolutely have to assume to get by and understand the world.
And the bare minimum is?
Cause and effect, working reliably, the external world being basically real, not just an illusion, and assuming we're not completely mad. Those seem pretty unavoidable.
Okay, that makes sense. Assume only what's necessary. This ties into another theme, doesn't it? The limits of reason itself.
Very much so. Hume really emphasized what you might call the modesty of reason. He often criticized the arrogance of philosophers who thought they could reason their way to absolute certainty about everything.
He thought we should be more humble about our mental powers.
Yes, he even suggested we should make a kind of merit of our very ignorance. recognize the limits. And because reason is limited, he argued, we should confine our inquiries to subjects that are actually within the scope of human understanding, focusing on common life, on experience.
Don't waste time speculating about things we can never really know, like the ultimate nature of reality.
Pretty much. It actually sounds a bit like Confucius again, who famously refused to speculate about the afterlife or ultimate metaphysical questions. Stick to the human realm.
But he wasn't rejecting reason, was he?
No, not at all. He was arguing against an overestimation of reason, particularly an individualistic view of it. The book mentions modern theories, like Mercier and Sperber's argumentative theory of reasoning, which suggests reason evolved more for social persuasion and evaluation of arguments than for solitary truth-seeking.
So reason works best when we're bouncing ideas off each other.
That fits Hume's view quite well. He wrote that understanding can kind of undermine itself when it tries to operate totally alone, detached from our other faculties and from society. He himself expressed profound doubts about his own reasoning.
Philosophical modesty personified.
Right. He questioned his own relentless pursuit of truth, wondering if it was just some peculiar quirk of his own mind.
But even with all these doubts and limits, he still thought philosophy was worthwhile. Why bother if it's so flawed?
Because what's the alternative? That's Hume's point. The book explains his view. If you give up on careful reasoning and philosophy, flawed as it is, you're left with either dishonest pretense, pretending you know things you don't, or just throwing up your hands entirely. Superstition, maybe.
Neither sounds great.
Exactly. So Hume argued, we have to choose the best guide we have available. And philosophy, meaning careful reasoning based on experience, even with all its limitations, is still the safest and most agreeable guide compared to the alternatives.
Choose the least worst option, maybe.
Something like that. It's the best tool we've got for navigating complex questions.
Okay, now the book brings in another key Humean distinction, impressions and ideas. And it uses your own trip to La Flèche to illustrate it.
Yeah, that was Baggini's experience visiting, which serves as a good example. That direct, first-hand experience, seeing the town, the buildings, feeling the atmosphere. Those vivid, immediate sensations are what Hume called impressions.
The raw data input.
And then later, when you remember the trip or imagine it, that mental content is an idea. Ideas, for Hume, are basically fainter copies or reconstructions of original impressions. They lack that force and vivacity of direct experience.
So experience first, then thoughts or memories about it.
That's the core of it. This distinction was absolutely central to his treatise.
And this whole impressions ideas thing, it connects to that bigger historical debate, doesn't it? Nature versus nurture, innate ideas.
Right. The old battle between empiricists like Hume, who thought all knowledge ultimately comes from sense experience, impressions, and rationalists like Descartes or Leibniz, who believed we have certain innate ideas or principles built in from birth.
Where do we stand on that now?
Well, the book notes that the strict either of that debate is mostly behind us. We generally accept now that it's a complex interplay of nature and nurture, genes and experience.
Then the innate ideas part.
That's also more nuanced. The book mentions Bertrand Russell's take. Maybe basic principles of logic aren't derived from experience in a simple way, but experience is still necessary to elicit them, to bring them out. They're a priori, but not completely independent of experience.
And even Hume, the great empiricist, seemed to concede something similar.
He did, interestingly. Despite his emphasis on impressions, he admitted at one point that reason is nothing but a wonderful and unintelligible instinct in our souls.
An instinct. That sounds almost innate.
It does, doesn't it? He reiterated it later, too. So even Hume seemed to accept that not everything could be straightforwardly traced back to a specific sense impression. Our capacity to reason itself seems more fundamental.
So these distinctions can get pretty technical.
They can, but the book emphasizes the underlying spirit of Hume's view. The world of experience, the world we access through our senses and feelings, that's the primary reality we can know and engage with. That's where philosophy needs to be grounded.
Okay, so let's try to wrap this up. We've covered a lot of ground on Hume's practical wisdom.
We really have. I mean, the key thing is seeing Hume not just as this abstract philosopher, but someone who believed deeply that understanding our own nature through experience was the absolute key to living a better, more moral life.
And he practiced what he preached, aiming for that balanced existence, reason and emotion, work and play, intellectual pursuits, but also simple human connection and enjoyment.
Definitely. We also touched on the importance of context, acknowledging his serious flaws, like his racism, which serves as that crucial reminder about not deifying any thinker, no matter how brilliant. Critical thinking always applies.
And that lesson about balance came from his own struggles, that disease of the learned, leading to his lifelong advice on moderation and well-being.
Right. And then there's his nuanced skepticism, questioning the limits of reason, the basis of our belief in cause and effect, but ultimately landing on the necessity of certain core assumptions just to function.
Assume only what you need to, and approach it all with that philosophical modesty he championed,
Acknowledge the limits of reason, but still use it as our best available guide.
and grounding it all in experience those impressions and ideas as the foundation of our knowledge.
That's the bedrock.
So for you listening, as you go about your day, maybe reflect on some of this. How could Hume's focus on experience, on finding balance, on intellectual humility, inform how you approach things, how you try to understand the world, and maybe yourself?
And here's a final thought to chew on, building on what we discussed. Hume really underscored the social aspect of our understanding, even if we only touched on it briefly with factionalism and reason. So consider this. How might actively engaging with different viewpoints, maybe especially the ones you find challenging or disagree with, actually strengthen your own understanding, your own reasoning, and maybe even contribute to your overall well-being in a truly Humean sense?